Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. Hello there, IU fans. It's Jerod here. The regular season is over and the tournaments are fast approaching. Big Ten tournament starts Wednesday, and hopefully, expectedly, Indiana should be in the NCAA tournament, which starts next week. So a lot of fun basketball, fun talk ahead of us on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Alex Bozich and I run through a number of topics. We talk about whether this regular season for Indiana, independent obviously of what happens in the postseason, but if just the regular season should be considered a success. We talk about Indiana's upcoming opponent, Nebraska. They're going to be very limited on Wednesday night. Our feelings about that game, our feelings about the potential Thursday night matchup against Penn State, and then what could lie ahead for Indiana, if they're able to make a little run in the Big Ten tournament. Then we break down the entire bracket, talk about what teams we expect to be there in the end. And then we look at the Big Ten awards, Coach of the Year, all Big Ten teams, Freshman of the Year, all that stuff. Obviously, we gave our predictions, our thoughts on it last week, but then we react to what the actual recipients were. And then breaking news late in the podcast, as one conference already canceled their conference tournament. So react to that a little bit, but, basically just previewing tournament time, reacting to the end of the regular season, and getting ready for what hopefully will still be a few more weeks of basketball with a lot of games. So we will see. Before we get to that, though, I do want to talk about Home Field Apparel. Our friends at Home Field Apparel, Connor and the guys, they're IU grads. They're based in Indianapolis. They do an incredible job, and really they've done an incredible job of building a business with a really unique idea, which is that, Indiana University and a lot of big colleges, a lot of small colleges have logos from the past that people really liked, but that just aren't in use anymore. And so they have gone to these different colleges, they've gotten the licensing deals worked out, and they've pulled these old logos back. So that's why on their Indiana page, you see the Bison logo, you see the old Indiana basketball shoes logo. They just released a new shirt with the script Hoosiers. So we all know Script Indiana because it's on the famous shooting shirts, but you might not have seen the script Hoosiers that was on a shooting shirt, I think, in the early 70s. So they've got a t-shirt out now with that. And it's just, it allows you to find unique ways to show your support for Indiana or maybe, other universities that you went to or that family members went to, and their gear is so incredibly comfortable. I mean, from the moment that you pull it out of the package, to 10 times later washing it, because trust me, I know, I've got shirts that I wear all the time that I've washed 10 times. It's all comfortable, T-shirts, long-sleeve tees, crew neck sweaters, hoodies. It's all really comfortable. It's all unique. It's all interesting gear. So that's why you should go there. Go to homefieldapparel.com. Use the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K. You'll get 20% off your entire order. So not just one item, but the entire order. Stock up. Order stuff for Indiana's tournament run. Get birthday presents. Heck, get Christmas presents. Let's get out ahead of this, right? It's all right there. Homefieldapparel.com. Promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, for 20% off. All right. Now here's my conversation with Alex Bozich, talking Indiana basketball. All right, Alex, the regular season is over. The Big Ten tournament is about to begin tomorrow night, unfortunately, for Indiana, as they will play in the Wednesday game. We'll get to that in a second. Before we get to that stuff, before we react to the All Big Ten teams that came out last night, I just want to look back real quick. Obviously, Indiana, disappointing finish to the season, losing that game against Wisconsin, where it really felt like they were in control of the game with about 8-9 minutes to go in the second half, and just another complete collapse at home, which is really disappointing. As you look now at the totality of the regular season, do you consider this regular season a success for Archie Miller?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I would say overall,
I think it's especially interesting to answer before we figure out if they're going to go to the NCAA tournament. Because that will obviously, color it. If they make the NCAA tournament, I think a lot of us will at least feel like they met the minimum bar for success, and they seem to be in a position to do that. But before we even know that, that's why I'm kind of curious to ask the question before we get to Selection Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I would say it's about what I expected. You know, in the preseason, I took some flack, I think, from IU fans for picking them to finish ninth in the conference. They actually finished, I think, in a tie for 10th. Is that right, with Purdue?
Yeah.
So about where I expected. The one thing I will say in the preseason, I didn't necessarily think that the league would be this strong. So maybe their overall performance has been a little bit stronger than what I anticipated relative to just kind of how the league has shaken out. But yeah, I mean, I think they've put themselves in pretty good position to make the tournament. So overall, I would define it as a success to this point. Now that is contingent, obviously, on kind of taking care of business this week in Indianapolis and go ahead and punch that ticket. But in terms of kind of what they've done so far to this point, I would say it's about what I expected. You know, I always said in the preseason, first year there was no tournament at all. Second year NIT, third year the next logical step. I think for Archie Miller to kind of claim that he's making progress and for fans to kind of feel good about the direction was just getting into the tournament. Now, at some point, there's going to have to be something better than just making the tournament in the not too distant future. I feel like if they make the tournament this year, I guess the next step next year would be, you know, getting a much better seed and having a chance to, you know, to advance to a level, I guess, that's kind of suggests that the program is kind of trending to be relevant from a national perspective again.
Yeah, I mean, it essentially feels like, you know, for 3 straight years now, Archie and the team have essentially met the very minimum standard for success for that season. You know, it's like last year you make the NIT, okay, nobody's happy with that, but it did represent a step forward from the previous season, so it's like, okay, that's progress. You know, whether you want to call it success or not, it's still at least a step in the right direction. This year, you know, the preseason expectations were modest, but I think a lot of us said if they make the NCAA tournament, that's a success. You know, essentially, like, that's the minimum bar. You get there, we'll grant that it was a success, and it seems like they're going to do that. Now, look, they could make a run in the Big Ten tournament. They could make the NCAA tournament and make a run there and, you know, exceed that, you know, based on what they do in the postseason, because that's obviously important. But I think based on where they're at in the regular season, you know, 19-12, you're still under 500 in the conference, but the conference was good. You know, you look at, you know, those 2 games that they had in hand before collapsing at home, the Maryland game and the Wisconsin game. You win those games and get to 11-9, you're in a tie for 5th place with Penn State, Ohio State, and Rutgers. You know, now that could go the other way too, and you could say, well, they had to come back against Northwestern, and they had, you know, the Michigan State game was close. So I mean, you always have to kind of balance those things out. But it is interesting to look at how close they were to having, if they can just close out those games that they're in position to win, to having a season that everybody would say, hey, this was a really big step forward. So there were signs of progress, and now it's going to be interesting to see what kind of momentum they can kind of build here in the postseason for the offseason. Because obviously I think a lot of the way that people are going to end up feeling about this season is going to be determined by how they kind of finish it out now. And that's kind of what happens when you hit the minimum bar for success in the regular season. Now it's like, all right, let's see what happens in the postseason. And so, you know, so we will see. I mean, it's been an interesting season. It's been an up and down season. You know, and for as much better as it feels like Indiana's playing over the last 4 games, they've also lost 3 of them, you know, and I know just talking with IU fans and just the way that I react to it myself, a lot of us are very much willing to meet this team in the moment and where they are and assess each game, you know, based on how it relates to, you know, where they should be with this roster and you know, how they were the game before. Are they growing? And yet we're all just kind of waiting for that time where we're not looking for positives and losses and where we're not trying to talk ourselves into optimism about finishing 10th in the conference. It's like, I think you're right. Starting next season, it's like, okay, the minimum bar for success is going to go up. And it's going to be like, hey, we probably need to be a top 5 or 6 Big Ten team, you know, get a better seed. And I guess, look, if Archie keeps on the trajectory that he's on and just every year, you know, takes another step forward, I suppose we're what? You know, 5-6 years away from a Final Four, right? If we just stay on that trajectory. So that's something that we can hold on to. So, you know, I think there's going to be a mixed bag, I think, with how people feel about it. I think it's fair to look at it and say, you know, they did the minimum that they needed to do to feel good about the regular season. And it's fair to feel like there's still a lot of meat on the bone for what Indiana basketball can be.
Yeah, I would say his rant the other day about bracketology, I would say that's probably only going to be looked at as acceptable by fans. It's happening once, right? Indiana doesn't want to be a program that's clawing its way into the tournament every year. Last year was, they were a bubble team. This year they're, we can debate as to whether how close they actually are to the bubble right now. Most of the reputable bracketologists at this point don't have them all that close to the actual cut line. But I would say in general, Indiana fans don't even want to have to think about bracketology in the coming years. They want to think about, are they going to get a pod assigned to them that's close enough for them to be able to travel easily. They want to know, who, once they get to the Sweet 16, who's the potential team that could knock them off there. Not if we get in as a 10 or 11, do we have a chance to actually make a run? So it's kind of shifting from that mentality of right now being the underdog, which is what Indiana is and should, quite frankly, by most of, if you talk to most Indiana fans, should never be in this position. They need to kind of shift from, being that team that's fighting for its position in the tournament to a team that's expected to advance and win games consistently.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you can ever expect the Final Four, because I just think it's so hard when there's so many variables, matchups, and all that stuff. But I will say that I don't think it's too much to ask to expect that you're in the tournament safely every season. I think if that could be like the norm, which it hasn't been for 20 years now for IU basketball, but if you could just say, every year we're going to make the tournament, I think fans would take that and kind of take their chances with the results that happen after that point.
Yeah, I think, the position that you want to be in is every year make the tournament. And pretty much know as an IU fan that when you sit down to do your bracket, you're writing your team into the Sweet 16. Because if you're one of the top 25 teams in the country consistently, you're going to be doing that. And then it's based on matchups and based on how the bracket opens. And, maybe you're a little better this year than you are next year, but you've got a chance to make a run, as opposed to just sneaking in. So I agree with you. And again, I think Archie deserves credit for continuing to keep the program on a forward trajectory. And if that continues, everyone's eventually going to be happy, especially if he can sustain it. But I do get, I understand, I share, some of the feelings of like, all right, let's get this going a little bit. I figured we'd be a little further along by now. But I think we'll all just be very excited if they can make the NCAA tournament, be able to enjoy a Selection Sunday again, have a bracket with Indiana in it. The other position that you don't want to be in on an annual basis, obviously, is A, playing on Wednesday in the Big Ten tournament, and B, feeling like you need to avoid disaster to not get yourself closer to the cut line. Because while you're right, I don't think Indiana is right on the bubble right now, according to most bracketologists. One of the strongest elements of their resume is no losses to bad teams. I don't like the phrase no bad losses, because Indiana does have some bad losses in terms of getting their butts kicked by good teams, but they don't have any losses to bad teams. And, a lot of schools above them do. Duke lost to Stephen F. Austin. Kentucky lost to Evansville. Like, a lot of teams this year have kind of lost games that make you scratch your head. Indiana has lost games by methods that make you scratch your head, but not really to teams that make you scratch your head, outside of maybe the Arkansas game at home. But, if you look at the context there, they missed Isaiah Joe for 5 or 6 games. And if he had played for all those games, Arkansas, might be a much higher ranked team. So that was still a decent team that they lost to. Not excusing it. They should not have lost that game. But the point is they haven't lost any games to bad teams. That's what's at stake Wednesday night against Nebraska. Nebraska is a bad team. Nebraska has lost 12 games in a row, I think, to end the season. Deshaun Burke, who scored 25 points against Indiana in the first game and 12 in the second game, he's their highest usage player. He for sure isn't playing. I haven't seen anything about if Cam Mack is going to play or not, but Burke for sure isn't playing. So there is, literally no excuse for Indiana not winning this game. And it probably should be a game they win comfortably. Now, it's the Big Ten tournament. We know Indiana's history in the Big Ten tournament, so I will fault no Indiana fans for approaching the game with humility and even a little bit of fear. But it's absolutely a game that Indiana should win. And if they do, then they're going to set up to play Penn State in a game that could get them to win 21 and be another nice neutral court win on the resume. So, they can do some things here to really push themselves up, maybe get back into that 9 seed line, something like that. Like there's a big opportunity for them in the Big Ten tournament, to say nothing of actually making a run in it. But if we focus on this Wednesday game, and, Devontae Green obviously is dealing with an ankle. That's going to be a little bit of an issue for Indiana because we know the scoring punch he provides. But even with that, this is a game Indiana, I feel like, really should go out and set the tone for what they're going to do in postseason play and dominate Nebraska. And, look, we need to win. We need to avert disaster. But anything short of really playing a strong game where you pretty convincingly beat them, I'm going to be a little bit disappointed watching. But again, the biggest key is just win, just avoid disaster, because that's the one thing that could maybe put you back on the razor's edge when it comes to the tournament. Fair?
Yeah, and I don't want to spend very much time talking about Nebraska and their team because it's quite frankly a train wreck disaster. As you mentioned, we don't know for sure as we record this. I think Fred Hoiberg is going to be talking to the media this morning at some point. But, it would be surprising to me if Cam Mack played. We'll see. I don't really think it matters at this point. Indiana's playing a game less than an hour away from its campus against a team that hasn't won since January 7th. If they can't win this game, I will say at that point, they would have no argument if they miss the tournament, because basically, I know how end of the season results don't necessarily matter, but there would be no justifying a performance like that. So just go out, take care of business, give yourself a chance at another solid win on Thursday against Penn State, and then let the chips fall where they may. But it goes without saying, people should expect Indiana to win this game, and if they don't, then they deserve anything that happens to them after that point.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And look, I've made lots of jokes on Twitter. I made a joke earlier today about how, this game is setting up to be an absolute breeze of a warm-up test for Penn State, or the cruelest joke the Big Ten tournament has ever played on Indiana, without really much in between. And that's kind of tongue-in-cheek. Like, I fully expect Indiana to win this game. We all just kind of, again, approach the Big Ten tournament with a little bit of fear because unexpected disasters, tend to happen to Indiana. And until we get some good experiences in the Big Ten tournament, those jokes will just play out every single season, and rightfully so. So I don't really want to tempt fate, but, we're just podcasters talking about the team. We're not, the coaches looking ahead. If you look ahead to that Thursday game against Penn State, how do you feel about that game? Because that's a game on a neutral court. I actually kind of feel, especially if Devontae can give you some minutes, I feel somewhat good about that game. Now, Penn State kicked Indiana's butt in the second half up in Happy Valley, and obviously, ended up leading Indiana by 6, I think, at one point in the second half at home, before Indiana was able to come back and win that game. But they, after a really hot stretch in the middle of the Big Ten season, they've lost 5 out of 6 games. And it kind of feels like, again, Indiana's lost 3 out of 4, so you can, kind of look at it that way too. But, of all the teams that you could get matched up with in a Thursday game, it feels like you might be catching Penn State at a good time, especially when they just lost by 11 to Northwestern. So it does feel like there's a path there for Indiana to play on Friday if they can play some reasonable basketball.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at the potential scenarios, and there was a chance, obviously, that they could have played Ohio State. I wouldn't have liked that matchup for Indiana at all, just based on how poorly they've played against Ohio State under Archie Miller. They've just got the one win this year at home. So, and even looking ahead, you don't want to look past Penn State, because obviously that's a game that there's no sure thing that Indiana can beat Penn State. But also getting Maryland, I think, is maybe better than some of the other alternatives in that, in terms of having Michigan State maybe on that Friday game. I think this sets Indiana up with a real chance to get to Friday and then give themselves at that point, they're solidly in if they can beat Penn State, and then you're talking about just playing for better seeding at that point. So it's going to be interesting. I've learned, though, to never predict success in the Big Ten tournament. As I mentioned on Twitter yesterday, I was there for the Hoff-Arbor shot. I was there for the Rob Wilson game, and I was also there for the Cam Chapman Michigan State Michigan three-pointer in the corner when Indiana was the top seed. All 3 of those were in Indianapolis.
And that's just a partial list of the
right. There's
the
more.
Performances.
There's more. There's obviously more. I think Indiana's something like a ridiculous 12-22, I think, all time in the Big Ten tournament. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Okay. So you want Big Ten stat of the day? If Indiana beats Nebraska to face Penn State, That game will be for sole possession of 9th place all time in Big Ten tournament winning percentage. So a lot on the line there between Indiana and Penn State. 9th place.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom it. And then the one year that they had the Rob Wilson game, I think that was the year that in the previous game Verdell got hurt.
Yes, which to me is the worst moment of all because it meant that Verdell Jones didn't get to play in the NCAA tournament, which was just awful. Awful.
For sure.
Yeah.
What do you think? What are your thoughts just kind of on the rest of the Big Ten bracket? Who do you if you were going to fill out a Big Ten tournament bracket?
I need to pull it out. I've been so hyper-focused on Indiana's path. What are the games up at the top? I haven't even looked at the rest of it.
Okay, so you obviously got Northwestern, Minnesota, Nebraska, Indiana on Wednesday. I would think most people are probably going to pick Minnesota and Indiana to move on. Then you have, to start off Thursday, you got an interesting game between Michigan and Rutgers. And, the top half of the bracket, the favorites are obviously Wisconsin and Illinois. The bottom half, Michigan State and Maryland.
Yeah.
I kind of like Michigan at the top half, even though they've had some maybe tough performances later in the season. I just trust their older players, and it always seems like, I know it's a different coach, but it always seems like Michigan plays well in the Big Ten tournament. So on the top half of the bracket, I would not be surprised to see Michigan make a run to at least Saturday, maybe Sunday.
So here's what I would say about that. Number one, Michigan State has clearly been the best team in the conference by efficiency margin, and they seem to be playing better. Some of their young guys are playing better. I'm going to be surprised if they don't win the whole thing. So I'll just say, unless, of course, we face them because Archie Miller doesn't lose to Tom Izzo. So if that happens, then you got to like Indiana's chances. I kid somewhat. But Michigan State, to me, is the clear favorite going into it. Here's what I would say about Michigan. If they make a run, this would be Juwan Howard's first chance as a head coach, having to coach teams back to back to back, playing games in back to back days. Now, I guess he did it earlier this season. I guess that's true, and they did well there. But still, in a Big Ten tournament, here's the thing. In their next round, they would face Wisconsin. And, watching Wisconsin against Indiana in that, in the second half of that game on Saturday, what we saw were, two teams that just dealt with the pressure, the game pressure of the end of that game totally differently. Indiana got really tight. Indiana missed shots. They took bad shots. They short-armed shots. Indiana really looked like a team that was desperate to try to not to lose a game. And Wisconsin was just calm the whole way through. They just kept making plays. Like, even when they were down 8, like, just body language and the way they were playing, it never felt like they were panicking. Like, I don't think you could tell the difference if they were up 8 or down 8. And, their guards, Trice and Davison, hadn't done a whole lot early in the game, and they came through and made shots. They came through and made plays. Obviously Potter, got some big rebounds. So there's a poise and a quiet confidence about them right now that's really impressive. And that's, we've seen that from Wisconsin a lot over the last couple of decades. Maybe not as much the last few seasons, but they seem to have, I don't know if I would call it a Wisconsin swagger, because Wisconsin never really has swagger, but when they're playing well, there's just like a complete calm and confidence about the way that they play, and I saw that from them again on Saturday, which, is why they tied for the lead in the, tied for the conference championship. So, I know it's easy, they're the number 1 and 2 seeds, so it's kind of a cop-out to say those are going to be the two teams that are going to play, but I'm really going to be surprised if it's not Wisconsin and Michigan State, because I just feel like they're playing head and shoulders above anybody right now, and so I have a hard time seeing them lose. It's not like either one of those teams backed into the title. They really played their best basketball at the end of the season, which is part of why I think, Izzo and Guard were the two top contenders for Big Ten Coach of the Year. So I could try to talk myself into somebody else, but I really just feel like it's going to be those two teams because they're playing the best. They're calm. They've got good guard play at the end of games. They've got big men who can defend. I just think they're clearly the two best teams in the conference right now.
Yeah, the other thing I'm looking at in the top half of that bracket is the potential for a Friday afternoon game between Iowa and Illinois, just based on everything we saw to close the regular season. I think that would be a pretty interesting game just to see, because it's obvious. Clearly, Io said it. These two teams don't like each other. You could tell some of the Iowa players were not very happy after kind of how that game ended. So that to me would be interesting. It's set. I mean, if kind of things hold, I mean, Rutgers is seated higher than Michigan, and I expect Michigan to move on. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if Rutgers, but I think it could be, I mean, an awesome day of games on Friday. If
Oh yeah,
Michigan, Wisconsin, potentially Illinois, Iowa, Michigan State versus either Purdue or Ohio State. And if Purdue beats Ohio State, all of a sudden, you're talking about having a chance against Michigan State. Who knows, what that does for their tournament hopes. I know
they're probably playing for a tournament bid at that point, I would think.
And then the bottom half of the bracket, you could have, either Indiana or Penn State against Maryland, who, we'll see how, Mark Turgeon does. He hasn't, I don't think, been very good in the Big Ten tournament in general at Maryland. So it's setting up to be potentially a really great day of games on Friday in Indianapolis.
It is. And I think I speak on behalf of all IU fans when I say, I just want to be a part of it. You know what the worst part about the last 3 years has been? Is it's felt like we've been on the outside looking in for so much of it. Whether it's the NCAA tournament or, doing anything in the Big Ten tournament or contending in the Big Ten. Like it feels like Indiana's been one of those teams that's on the outside looking in. And that would be the real shame, if you beat Nebraska, you lose to Penn State. Right now you get Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They're going to be great games, but you want your team to be a part of it. So that's the thing. I mean, Friday sets up to be an amazing day of games, and it would be even more amazing if the capper at the end is a chance to get, a little revenge on Maryland for that home game, and to, again, I mean, get a win that would really start to improve Indiana's NCAA tournament seed at that point. And I know that's way down the line. That's, 2 games away in the Big Ten tournament, which, feels like 10,000 miles. But I just think,
do you feel like just winning on Wednesday, if Indiana does that at that point, do you feel confident they're in?
Yeah. Oh yeah. 20 wins, no bad losses. The resume that they have stacked up against other people. I think at a minimum you would see them be, a 10 seed, and I think you've got a chance to be a 9 seed still, depending on what the committee this year values. Yeah, absolutely. I think you lose, and now you give the committee reasons to put you in Dayton or to even leave you out of the field. I'm not saying they would. I mean, you could still make an argument even if they lose that game, depending on what happens around the bubble. But, I mean, if you lose that game and there start to be bid thieves and other stuff happens, that's what Mike DeCourcy said on Banner Monday yesterday. You give the committee a reason to, one of the strongest points of your resume is no longer that strong. And so that's why it's so important. People say a win's not going to do much for you, but a loss would be disastrous. Well, yeah, that's why a win would do a lot for you because the loss is going to be killer, so you're not going to get extra credit for beating Nebraska, but, you avoid really getting knocked down a peg. So yeah, I mean, they've got to win that game. I mean, and just with what Nebraska's probably bringing to the table, I mean, you have to win that game. And I tend to agree with you. You lose that game, you don't really have a compelling argument if they decide to leave you out of the tournament at that point. So hopefully, look, I'm confident they're going to win that game. I'm really looking forward to a good Thursday night game against Penn State, which I also kind of feel like that's a good matchup. I won't say confident, but that feels like a good, even matchup on a neutral court that'd be fun to watch, and it would just be great to be part of it on Friday.
It might not even be a neutral court. How many fans are Penn State? How many fans is Penn State going to bring to Indianapolis?
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but it's still not. You're not playing in your home gym, where you're comfortable.
Right. No, but I'm saying it should be a favorable environment for Indiana. That's assuming that this whole thing kind of goes off as we play it. We're still. I feel like there's still this big gray cloud looming over us, just trying to figure out how all of this is going to work over these next couple of weeks as we learn of more different cancellations of different events around the country.
Well, that too.
That's kind of the different variables here. I feel like there's a lot still to play out. Obviously, the Big Ten tournament's going to happen. I'm just kind of curious to kind of see how it all unfolds and in a time of uncertainty right now.
Yeah. Let's react real quick to the Big Ten awards that came out yesterday. On our previous podcast, we gave our picks for them. I want to start with Coach of the Year because we had a good conversation about Coach of the Year. And one thing I will say about what I said on the previous episode, because I said that I thought Tom Izzo was the choice. And I think I would still give it to him, but I will say a lot of the arguments people have made for Greg Gard since then, I've been swayed by. And, I also in a total lapse of memory, forgot about what they had dealt with in the offseason with Howard Moore and what they've dealt with all season. And that is because, part of my argument for Izzo is what they've dealt with Cassius Winston all season long and how difficult that is. And I'm sure every coach and every team has dealt with, their share of personal issues. These are the ones that, we know about. They're the most high profile ones, but, they also seem like the most tragic ones. And, for Greg Gard, to guide his team through that, where it's, an assistant coach and such a valued member of what they're doing all season long, I do think a coach deserves extra credit for that, because you're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds who are, emotional as it is, and still, kind of, developing some of that higher level ability to regulate their emotions and make decisions and all of those things. And so that's a big, big part of a coach's job, even though we don't talk about it a lot because we get caught up in X's and O's and recruiting and all that stuff. But I've been swayed a lot by the Greg Gard arguments. I still would side with Tom Izzo like 51% to 49% just because Michigan State has been far and away the best team in terms of efficiency margin. So, and I get that Wisconsin outperformed preseason expectations more than Michigan State did, but Tom Izzo also built a team that had strong preseason expectations, and I think that's actually part of the job too. So it all depends on your criteria. But, I think those were the top two, and I'm glad that Brad Underwood has gotten some discussion too, because Peichel is kind of the obvious next guy that people have talked about, but I thought Brad Underwood deserved a lot of discussion too, and I'm glad that he's gotten it. So it's in a conference season this just filled with good teams, 11 of the top 30 KenPom teams, and so competitive, you're going to have a lot of good choices for Coach of the Year, and I think you do. So there's, that small handful, I wouldn't really fault anybody for picking any of them, because in any individual year, they'd all be great choices.
I'm just glad that we've moved away from honoring Pat Chambers with the Lifetime Achievement Coaching Award if he would have got it. I mean, I think a couple of weeks ago he probably would have been the favorite, and now I don't think he's probably higher than fifth in the minds of most people. So I think that's
a couple weeks ago they won 4 straight road games and were in the driver's seat for the Big Ten.
Right?
Exactly.
That's why we don't hand out awards 75% into the season. And I'm glad that I could have gone either way on Gard, Izzo, and Underwood for different reasons, but I have no problem with Gard getting the award. I mean, Wisconsin, they've gone through a lot this season. Obviously, Michigan State has too, to a different extent, and in terms of off-court issues. But Wisconsin had some off-court issues that it dealt with as well. So I got no problem with any of those guys winning the award, and happy to see Greg Gard rewarded for it. He seems like, I don't know him, haven't really interacted with him much, but seems like a genuinely good guy who deserves the success he's had.
Did you have any issue with Kofi Cockburn winning Freshman of the Year over Trace Jackson Davis?
I didn't have an issue with it. I mean, I wouldn't have picked him, but it was more of, I think both of them had really good years, and I think at that point you kind of look at which team maybe had a little bit more success, and that's probably how most people voted. But I agree with Archie's comments from his radio show last night where he said that Trace was more the focal point of his team and he didn't necessarily have the help that Kofi had. But I don't have a problem with Kofi winning it. They were both, I think, unanimous all-freshman team. I think Trace made third team All-Big Ten. Kofi made third team on one of the lists and honorable mention on the other, which I thought was kind of weird. I wasn't outraged by it or anything. It kind of feels like the Oladipo Trey Burke year where either one of them could have won Big Ten Player of the Year. Both would have been deserving, and you can only pick one. So, if Indiana, like you said, if they would have taken care of business in a couple more of those home games and finished something like 11-9, I think the awards Trace's to lose, but that didn't happen, and so Kofi gets the award, and I think it was well deserved. He played well all year, and obviously was a difference maker for Illinois this year.
Yeah, I still would have given it to Trace. I agree with Archie's comments. I think it, obviously Trace didn't have a very good game against Wisconsin there at the end, and when he and Kofi played head to head, Kofi Cockburn was huge in the second half of that game. But I think, it's easy to look at Kofi Cockburn and just say like, oh, well, he was so dominant defensively. You might surprise some people to know that Trace Jackson Davis actually had a higher block rate than Kofi Cockburn did, and was, basically the same level of rebounder, maybe just a half notch below Kofi Cockburn. The other thing that might be surprising to people is that Kofi Cockburn used 25% of possessions and Trace only used 21.9% of possessions, which is surprising. And I think, that's one of the things, if you kind of look at, man, where were some missed opportunities for Indiana, that number not being higher is maybe something that could have led you to a couple more wins, whether it's, because of, Trace being injured at the end of the year, games where he just didn't bring it, flaws with the offense. That number being that low to me is an indictment of what Indiana did offensively overall this year. They got to find a way to get him the ball more. And he's got to, demand it more. And the guards have to get, I think it's a full kind of team responsibility there. But that, when I look at the individual numbers, that number for Indiana jumps out to me more than any other.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in one of my 5 takeaways after Indiana lost a home game. It might have been after the Maryland game, but you just look at the usage rate of many of the big front court players in the league, and Trace's was near the bottom of the list in terms of, the main front court players. You look at, obviously, Luka Garza, you look at Daniel Oturu, you look at Kofi, you look at Xavier Tillman, you look at John Teskey. I mean, I think his usage rate was lower than all those guys. Jalen Smith, kind of the list goes on. And when you have a guy that finishes at such an efficient rate, why not try to feature him more, give him the ball more? But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that Indiana can work on and improve going forward next season. I think definitely Trace needs to be a guy that's getting 16, 17, 18 points a game rather than 13.
Yeah, I wonder, obviously it was one of the big reasons that Illinois made their jump this year is that Ayo Dosunmu decided to stay in school, and he really took a lot of attention that helped Kofi to be able to play off of him, and so think about if Romeo had decided to stay in school for Indiana, what that would have done for Trace. It would have been different. I mean, Trace instead had to step into the focal point, and I think that context should matter. So that's why, to me, a freshman dealing with being the focal point every game, that's why he should have won Freshman of the Year, to me. Even if you're trying to do a side-by-side comparison, the numbers, it looks real close. Context matters. So I still, even with Trace struggling at the end of the season and Kofi outplaying him at the end of the head-to-head battle, I still would have given it to Trace. I had one major quibble with the All Big Ten teams. What were your thoughts on them? At least the first team All Big Ten. Which I guess we should state it. The first team All Big Ten for the media was Ayo, Luka, Jalen Smith, Cassius Winston, Lamar Stevens. And first team All Big Ten for the coaches was Luka, Anthony Cowan, Jalen Smith, Cassius Winston, Lamar Stevens.
So Tillman didn't make first team on either?
On either one, which is my big quibble. The best he was defensive player of the year in the conference.
I mean, I would have had Oturu, I think, on there somehow ahead of Anthony Cowan. I don't necessarily think Maryland's play overall warrants having 2 players on the first team, especially if Michigan State's by far, in terms of efficiency margin, the best team in the league. How do you justify having 2 Maryland players and only 1 Michigan State player? So I'll let you launch into your Tillman discussion here, but I agree with you. He should have been on there, or Oturu. If you're, I don't necessarily think you punish him because he was on Minnesota that didn't have much help for him. I think he was a pretty darn good player the whole season.
So I'll say, before I really dug into the numbers, I was biased against Oturu, just because I wasn't. He put up numbers against Indiana, but I wasn't terribly impressed with the way that he played. But then when you actually look at his overall numbers, they are so overwhelming. It's really hard to keep him off. I mean, yeah, Minnesota wasn't very good, but man, when you can lock in those numbers on a game-by-game basis, isn't that essentially the argument for Luka Garza, and the team around
Lamar
him is
Stevens,
just a little
right?
better?
If you're just counting stats,
same thing.
I mean,
same thing. Yeah. So, and I think the thing with Cowan and Ayo is, their numbers actually aren't that impressive. They're good. I mean, those guys should both be second team All Big Ten players at a minimum. But I think you could easily argue that those guys shouldn't be first team All Big Ten, but they have big moments, and that's what helps. I mean, Ayo hit big shot after big shot. Anthony Cowan was huge in some of Maryland's comebacks, and that should matter. So how do you weigh that against the overall production, with a guy like Oturu? That's kind of a personal preference thing. To me, the guy that deserved to be on first team, no matter what, is Xavier Tillman. because he's the best defensive player in the conference. He, all these guys that we just talked about, Jalen Smith and Daniel Oturu and, Luka Garza. I mean, he harassed them into their worst games. He gave Tom Izzo the ability to really be kind of flexible defensively, and offensively, he was pretty good. I think the guys on the Moving Screen podcast, were talking about how, he had 3.5 assists a game, something like that. Which does Indiana have anybody that averaged that many? Maybe Finney got there, but I mean that's to be that productive offensively and be such a rock defensively. That is consistently my one quibble with these teams, is it really overvalues offensive production. And offensive production probably should be valued a little bit more, because there's nothing more valuable than putting the ball in the hole. So scoring probably should get more credit. But you've got to be able to factor in defense somehow. And we just don't have great metrics for defense, so it's easy to ignore it. Because I think, a lot of people, they can't watch every single game that teams play. So you're looking at stats a lot of times, which frankly is what I'm doing too. But just, kind of reading what people who have watched the teams closely say about them and the impact of Xavier Tillman. It seems ridiculous to me that he didn't make it when he's the best two-way player. Like, I feel like there should almost, if it's the best team in the conference, they have the highest efficiency margin, and you've got the guy that everyone agrees is the best two-way player in the conference, that guy should be on the first team. So I was disappointed that he didn't make it. Plus, the guy has 2 kids, and his wife just gave birth, and he did all of that going through that. That to me is extra impressive. So I give him any tiebreakers go to the guy that has 2 kids and just helped his wife through having another one.
So the beauty of doing podcasts during like press availabilities, well, there's 2 things. I mentioned one of them to you in the chat, but here's another one. Breaking news that Cam Mack and Deshaun Burke will not travel and play in the Big Ten tournament. So Nebraska down, obviously it's 2 best guards. The other piece of news, which kind of has me
this is
taking a step back,
shocking.
The Ivy League has canceled its conference tournament. So, okay, that's
and just earlier today, I saw Harvard had asked students not to come back from spring break, and they're moving to online classes. If I read that correctly.
Yeah. So it says here that the Yale men and the Princeton women will get the automatic NCAA tournament bid, and that they've canceled the conference tournament. So that.
Wow,
that's something. So, as I said, going to be I feel like an interesting couple of weeks here to see how this all plays out. Now, the Ivy League, I think, is a little bit different than the major power conferences in that they don't have the TV deal and they don't have the fans that are going to be showing up. That I guess the money that's riding on these other events, but we're in, like I said, a little bit of uncharted territory here to see how this all plays out. But
sure are. Also, breaking news: I just noticed that Andy Bottoms changed his Twitter avatar to the Count.
That was that was at my urging.
Oh, was it? Andy clearly leaning into Archie's rant.
Okay. I tweeted after he posted his bracketology this morning. I tweeted at him that I was disappointed that he didn't have a Sesame Street character as his avatar, and he updated it.
All right.
So
well done, Andy. Any other thoughts on the Big Ten awards? Trace Jackson Davis, obviously 3rd team. I think very deserving. I wouldn't have put him higher, but I think he absolutely belonged on the team.
No, nothing too. I thought it was pretty standard. There was a sportsmanship awards given out too. That I believe that Joey Brunk was the recipient from Indiana. So happy to see him.
Yep.
Get that. I went back a couple weeks and watched his segment on the Journey on Big Ten Network. You can get that on YouTube. I would encourage anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to watch that just to go watch it. I think it's 7 or 8 minutes, but just kind of gives you a little bit more insight into kind of what Joey dealt with the unfortunate passing of his father while he was at Butler. And just, like I said, anytime we can humanize these guys a little bit more and know them more as people and understand them, I think it's good for all of us to do so.
Last question for you before we get out of here. Assuming that there is an NCAA tournament, what's your gut feeling on how the Big Ten teams are going to do in the NCAA tournament? I know it's all based on matchups, I get all that, but just do you feel like this is going to be a year where there are going to be a lot of Big Ten teams that are there staying in the Sweet 16, or What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like it could be one of those years where there's like 5 or 6 Big Ten teams in the Sweet 16, and then maybe another year where we don't, as a league, win the national championship. But I think it'll be a strong showing, just based on the gauntlet that most of these teams have gone through throughout the regular season. I know other conferences are going to say that it's tough in our league too, but really there was no off nights in the Big Ten unless you were playing Nebraska or Northwestern. I felt like any team could beat anybody on a given night.
Penn State would like a word regarding playing Northwestern.
Well, Purdue and Iowa both lost to Nebraska too, so it's,
I know.
Wisconsin, but I think before it started its winning streak, lost by 18 at Minnesota. So
yeah,
like I said, I mean, there's
a weird conference season. Fun, competitive,
absolutely
intense, but very strange.
For sure.
I mean, the champions with 6 losses. That is, but that it made it fun. That's for sure. All right, Alex. So obviously we'll go through the Big Ten tournament, and then we'll have Selection Sunday, and then you and I will reconvene. We're going to do, obviously, over at the Assembly Call, we'll have post-game shows for every game that Indiana's in the Big Ten tournament. And then we're probably going to do a Selection Sunday podcast right after it's announced. If you want to hop on with us for that, by the way, come on. And then I guess you and I will do a podcast on the Brink probably early next week, previewing assuming Indiana makes the NCAA tournament, maybe we'll try and get someone from the opposing team to talk about that team. We'll have something for you early next week to talk about whatever Indiana's tournament fate is, or to lament whatever really went wrong between now and then that causes Indiana to not make the tournament. But I think at this point, I don't know, how would you handicap it? I feel like it's about an 85% chance Indiana makes the tournament. Maybe 90. Maybe 90.
About 95.
Yeah, I think it's, again, you avoid disaster Wednesday night. I think it's a virtual certainty. And I just leave a small percentage open for the potential for Big Ten tournament disaster and the potential for the selection committee doing something crazy, which every now and then happens. So those are the only things. But I think Indiana's resume stacks up well enough that most reasonable people think it's a very, very high likelihood. And that's when you've missed it for 3 straight years, that's a good position to be in. And if it happens, I'm going to be happy for Devontae and Duran that they're able to make it in. All right.
Yep.
We will hope for the best on Wednesday night. Well, we'll expect the best on Wednesday night, and then we'll hope for the best on Thursday night, and hopefully Indiana can have a nice little run this weekend in Indianapolis.
Looking forward to it.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.
Yep. Talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.